Welcome to the premiere episode of God. My name is George Ortega. We are very fortunate to have as our co-host and producer on this series. It's a Monday through Friday television series entirely about God, Joshua Bond. Joshua, before we introduce the show, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, I'll give you a little background about how I got here, how I met George, and how I got interested in all this. In college, I was doing engineering, and I also had a business on the side that I'd started when I was really young. Thought I'd combine those two, and that was my kind of career plan, life path. And you know, all of a sudden, I hit a wall, and things just started falling apart. Um, and it was seemed mysterious, and just losing grip on that reality that I had planned out so well. Um, from there, uh, I took a semester off and was really wrestling with all of this. And, my reality that was, as I was playing out did not fit my axioms, my paradigm of what I was taught, life is supposed to be about and how it's supposed to work. Um, I started reading a book called Come Help Change the World. And it's mostly the story of the founder of what became the largest evangelical organization in the world. They're in like 191 countries and 25,000 full-time career missionaries. And during that time, uh, I was spiritually seeking and yearning, obviously. That's when 9/11 happened, right? And so, that uh, affected all of us deeply, affected the collective unconscious, and all of us in different ways, coped with it in different ways, depending on our religious and political, um, dispositions. And from there, I gave my business to one of my employees. I didn't roll back in school. I got on a bus and went and worked with them and a couple other organizations for a few years. And this same disillusionment, essentially, that I experienced back there, kind of doing the engineering thing in my business, kept coming up in my life. Um, and so that ultimately led me getting back into business, and the same thing kept happening. So that led me on a path of seeking. So I looked into a lot of other wisdom traditions and a lot of other religions, and got into psychology and philosophy and even neuroscience, trying to make sense of reality again. Um, and I discovered a lot of answers and a lot of perspectives that I'd never heard, and was pretty hard to find, to be honest. Um, and so I saw George's work online, and that really inspired me and gave me a lot of direction. So I reached out to him and to coach me and do some mentoring. And then he let me know he was starting this show and invited me to co-host, and I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. All right, so this series, it's going to be about God. We're going to explore who God is, what God's attributes are, how we can relate to God. And a lot of this is going to have to be about defining what we mean by God. And so we're going to get into that. But before we do, we want to describe to you why this show is important to you, why this show is relevant to you, how you can use it in your personal lives outside of this theoretical conception of God and all. So Joshua, take us through this. Why is this show going to be important to our audience?
Yeah, really. For the same reason, I guess understanding and knowing God, anything that helps you um, do that in more detail and integrate that more is beneficial. It's like, trying to define God. Why would we want to know anybody who's just a little bit powerful and smarter than us, right? Um, I I don't have a definition of George, but I have a concept of George, and I saw his work, and it inspired me, and it impacted my life, and I was able to improve my life from that. And so, I don't have a definition of George, and I'm not saying you're omniscient and and all powerful, George. But why don't you share a little bit with the audience about your background?
Yeah, well, all right. So basically, I came to this, back, I did a television series. My first TV series back in, I think it was 2002, here in White Plains, was called Conversations in Mind. I did it with a couple of friends of mine, and that was about spiritual and psychological issues. And then we did 30 episodes of that. Then, as I was doing that show, it just dawned on me, wait a minute, life, our life, everybody's life is about happiness. This isn't an opinion. I mean, like for decades, social scientists have asked people, what do you want most in life? The number one answer is always happiness. They ask, well, what do you want most for your children? The number one answer is always happiness. So, all right, so I did a series on that, 138 episodes, and I've been working on my personal happiness for decades. I've led a lot of groups, discussion groups here in White Plains and in Manhattan about happiness. Then, then I began to explore this issue of human will. Why we do, who are we as human beings? And that got me to the idea that, well, it's a common misconception that what we do is up to us, who we are is up to us. And then I delved into it, and I went through the science, the philosophy, the religion, and it turns out that actually, what we do and who we are is not up to us in the slightest bit. It's all up to God. Okay, so back in 2010, I launched this initiative, this mission to popularize this notion that nobody has a free will. So after about 216 television shows, about the same number of podcasts. Actually, there was another TV show we did in Manhattan, a live call-in one, and a few books, the last one, a screenplay. It dawned on me that there's a resistance for people, that people have in accepting this idea that nothing that we do is up to us. So I think that was part of it. And I think the other part was about a year ago, I met a person who, this woman, she was part of a Unitarian congregation and a Buddhist group where we meditated. So I had been away from organized religion for about 35 years. Back in the 80s, I was practicing Orthodox Judaism, and before that, I was actually raised Episcopalian during my youth. I was born Jewish. I didn't find out I was Jewish until I was in my mid-20s and all. So anyway, after 35 years of being away from congregations, I find myself attending services, and that led to this, that I realized that, as part of presenting this understanding of who we are as human beings, I had kind of I'd addressed it, but perhaps not nearly completely enough, this matter that, wait, we are manifesting God's will. And it's really important that people know this. And not just that, but for my personal happiness, when I connected with God, when I connect my happiness to virtue, to understanding God, serving God, I experience it becoming much more complete, fulfilling. It's a much, one can be happy, doing trivial things, and one can be happy doing, very important things for the world, for oneself and all. So I found connecting the happiness to God, fulfilled that, just made the happiness much more relevant, much more important. All right, so, and that's so so I decided let's do a series entirely on God. The other part is my past series, that 60 episodes, was on how to prevent future pandemics, because we're in this coronavirus distancing, and it just dawned on me that, for example, the only way we're going to be free of future pandemics is to end factory farming. People don't want to hear this, but that's the reality. And so what dawned on me is this is a moral issue. It's not like we lack the technology to be pandemic risk free. We just lack the will, the resolve. So that's when, after 60 episodes of that show, I realized, all right, our world really needs to be connected much more so to God in order for us to summon up the virtue, the morality, to address these pandemics, to address climate change, to address all these, issues and challenges that our entire world is facing over the next several decades. All right, so that's pretty much how we got here, how I got here. Now, Joshua, let's talk about, understanding God in terms of our relationship, not just to God, but to ourselves and to each other.
Yeah, I mean that's ultimately seems to be, I mean when you think about happiness, right? There's a few ways to get there and a few aspects of that. Maybe you got to master, maybe to master just being happy no matter what the circumstances, and then some peace and prosperity and well-being, and maybe some fun in there. But it really comes down for a lot of people, for most people, most of the time, relationships, being able to have better relationships, not just to each other, but also to ourselves. And ultimately, that has been, the mission of religion and of understanding God is to make sense of the world, make sense of our place in it, and how to interact with the world. Um, and I think this is where, uh, even though you find this illusion issue in all the religions, and it's they're not in agreement on it. At least all the religions are in agreement on the relationship aspect, even though when it comes to the relationship with God, they kind of take it in a different approach. Whether it's you have a personal relationship with God, and you kind of define God and understand for God for yourself and figure out what works best for you, or we tell you, what God is and how he works or how she works, and there from that you are supposed to conform to, make those rules work.
Yeah, and then like this show is not just for the 80 or 90% of us here in the United States who believe in God or higher power. And, there's similar proportions throughout the world. This is also for the 10% of, for example, in the United States, atheists who don't believe that a God exists. One of the things we're going to like do is, in other words, like if we're going to relate to God, if we're going to have God in our lives, we have to have an accurate understanding of who God is. And sometimes religions get this right in some ways, sometimes they get it wrong. So basically, we're going to demonstrate, not certainly not all today, but through the upcoming episodes, that this idea of God is much more than a belief. And most people believe in God, have faith that God exists. We're going to present very powerful scientific, logical evidence, religious evidence that God, as God is presented in the Old Testament and New Testament, in Islam, three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we're going to like present powerful evidence that God must necessarily exists, so we can move from, well, I hope God exists, I believe God exists, I have faith, to a solid understanding that God must exist, and that will just be part of our becoming, getting closer to God.
Yeah, George, and I just wanted to reemphasize there that, you know, George and I have a lot of disagreements, and this is obviously we're just having a conversation basically between two people that we've had some conversations about it, and really, what led to this is through those conversations we kept stumbling onto these topics and these aspects that we felt like we were the only ones that had discovered, and we didn't know anybody else that had access to this readily. So we wanted to share those, but we're not actually trying to, we don't have a religion we're trying to convert, and even more so, we don't actually, have the same religion and religious values and views of God even necessarily. But it's just, kind of modeling out two people having a conversation about it, so it no longer has to be this, you know, the two things you don't talk about at the dinner table, or in family reunions, are religion and politics, right? Because it shouldn't be that way. And it doesn't matter whether your relatives or your visitors are, you know, are of a different Abrahamic religion than you, or of, from India, if they're Buddhist, if they're Hindu, whatever they are. I mean, George and I just found that there's just so much reinforcing evidence throughout all of these faiths and beliefs, and so much logical science even, that needs to be more widely dispersed, because you know um, belief is not just about faith, right? So if I understand something logically and rationally, then of course I believe that, right? And so we're hoping to kind of evolve the conversation from just belief through faith, and butting heads with science, or at least feeling like we're going to butt heads with science or other religions if we, go there, to realizing it's much simpler, it's much more unified, and it just makes a whole lot more sense when we actually just have the conversation out.
All right, and then Josh, you brought up a very important point. We agree on a lot of things. We don't agree on everything. And I think one of the problems with our conventional religions today is that they hold the position that our view is the only view. All other views are mistaken. And they hold that position with such fervency that they're very rarely able to have ecumenical conversations between the various religions that basically explore what they have in common and how they're, why the differences are. So like one of the things we're going to be doing in this series is showing that this can be done, that Josh and I could have different beliefs on certain things, but that what we agree in is much more important than what we disagree in. And a lot of times, it's like, a lot of times you'll see as we go through these episodes that a lot of times the disagreements that religions have between themselves and each other amount to semantics. One religion might have a certain word and they define it in a certain way, whereas a different religion has the same word, defines it in a slightly different word. So we're going to try to use this series to encourage the religions to basically, gain a more accurate, more productive understanding of God by communicating a lot more. Now, Josh, talk about today's religions in relation to God. I mean, what do you see the religions of today are doing good, that they're succeeding with, and what do you see that they are not doing as well with, and hopefully we can begin to present some kinds of answers, some kinds of possibilities of how not just our understanding of God can evolve, but our religions can evolve to reflect our more accurate, comprehensive understanding.
Well, the thing you just mentioned there, when it really comes down to semantics a lot, and this kind of legalistic view on semantics instead of balancing it with the other spiritual aspect that, whether it's defining love, God, consciousness, free will, any of these, the real issue, is how the interaction with the concept affects the person, right? So it's almost that we have a personal relationship with every word, and we know this is true. We all, like our own things, our own forms of music, our own foods, right? And we would never say, oh, well, this is the one right food, or this is how this food tastes good and that doesn't, or what this kind of food means, or this kind of music means something that the rest of it doesn't. And modern science, psychology, neuroscience, is all kind of illuminating a lot of this for us, and religions are kind of failing to kind of accept that, and a lot of them are kind of hardening their position. And as a result, some evidence of this is the people, the fastest growing religion right now are the people who check the nun box. They're the new nuns, as in I belong to none of the above religions. I'm spiritual. They may be spiritual but not religious, right? And when you understand spirituality and you understand that we're social beings, for me, I checked that box for a long time, and I got to this point where I realized that religion, the concept religion, had kind of become pejorative, and we look down on it. But if we're social beings, then individual spirituality can only take you so far, and we need to re-alive and reintegrate our religions through all aspects of human life. Not just this thing you do on church about on the weekends that's talking about theology or concepts that aren't able to connect for each individual directly with the things that's going on for them in their real life.
All right, Josh, you brought up the idea of love, and it's interesting because we had talked about the format for this show before over the last couple of weeks, and one of the things we talked about was this show is explicitly about God, but it's implicitly and perhaps more so about love. In other words, I've experienced it in my life that, for example, there are many ways to be happy. one can be happy, let's say, meditating all day, just a solitary existence that doesn't include anyone else. But just as there are forms of goodness that are higher than others. Some forms of goodness, like keeping your floor swept, is a form of goodness. Feeding the poor is a higher form of goodness. Just as like a virtue has these scales, so does happiness. And I came up with this understanding that love is, I believe, the highest form of happiness. So Josh, take us through the importance of love, to understanding God and to helping us not just relate to God, but to ourselves and each other in the best way possible.
Well, let's just run with a couple definitions and attributes of God. If you view God as the creator or the creator of everything, then God in essence is in everything, right? And when you realize that, and you realize that spirituality has much broader implications, right? So the way that anybody is reacting to a material item, right? Now we understand that addiction is real, right? Or that depression is real. Um, you know, we haven't always understood that as a species, and we used to think that was a moral failing, that just weren't trying hard enough, you were being lazy, you were sinning, and now we realize scientifically, um, we have overwhelming evidence that there becomes a point where the human being doesn't have any ability to respond enthusiastically and stay focused and stay on task, or to keep their mood elevated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to be able to respond to you or respond to each other in a way that would might be considered spiritually mature or godly, right? And so when we understand these attributes of God, as whether it's all knowing or all powerful, um, whichever ones you hold and find most dearest, then it immediately becomes integratable into all of life, right? Because ultimately our consciousness, again, is undoubtedly manifested or in relationship to our environment, to the stimuli in our environment and the stimuli in our bodies. So our genetics, our biochemistry, we know that our guts like a third brain right behind our heart, in our real brain, and controlling our mood depending on what the chemical makeup is in there. Um, and so when we realize that, from that perspective, to think of God as being in control, well, we get very quickly into realizing that God is in everything, and that's probably a pretty good definition that we could add a lot of value to our spiritual practices and our spiritual way of viewing the world, viewing ourselves, and interacting with all these components.
Excellent. All right. So, like, if we're going to talk about, let's say, love, that's something else we're going to have to define. And in a certain sense, to love yourself, to love other people, really means to want what's best for them, to want the greatest happiness, the greatest welfare, and all. And so, how does this understanding of God relate to that? As Josh was saying, if we see God as everything, God being everywhere, we're no longer separated from other people. It's no longer about us and them. We're no longer in conflict. We're seeing ourselves and each other as one, and that's important because, like, we find it much easier to love ourselves sometimes. So, like, if we expand this sense of personal self to include everyone else on the planet, to include God, then all of a sudden it makes loving other people much, much easier. And it makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot of sense why we're not going to just limit our what we do to what's going to benefit us, especially at the expense of other people. So it's important to understand, what it means to love ourselves and other people, and why this understanding of God as everything is very essential to our loving ourselves and others as much as we can.
Yeah, you did a great job of answering the question that you asked me that I forgot to answer. So, um, yeah. So whether you take a spiritual view or a material view or naturalistic view, you begin to see the same causality playing out, right? So you don't blame people when they act a certain way because you realize they're reacting, right? And you could say they don't have a good relationship to God, or they're spiritually immature, or you could look at it naturalistically or materialist or scientist and analyze, say they need some antidepressants or exercise or whatever it is. But ultimately you realize they become one and the same, and it becomes this, evolving technology, this evolving consciousness, this evolving form of religion that's been going on for thousands of years that's allowed us to get to this point where we can have a much, much more comprehensive, high resolution form of spirituality that, you know, that our forefathers, our ancestors in these religions, you know, would be rolling in their graves if they knew we weren't taking advantage of it, if they knew we weren't integrating spirituality through all these aspects of science and sociology and through all of our relationships in our career, so that we can, fulfill their goals that they set out to, create the spiritual disciplines, their goals for those spiritual disciplines to make their community better, to make their children's lives and their grandchildren's and so on lives better, and more spiritual and more peaceful and more prosperous and more happy, like you said.
Excellent. Again, so like, happiness, Aristotle defined it as the highest good. It's really what it's about, but it's not just about happiness at any cost, at any expense. We want to like use love and our connection to God to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. We have about a minute left. So I imagine like we'll be back tomorrow. Again, we're here every Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll have these episodes on YouTube and eventually on Spotify and iTunes as podcasts. So I guess next episode, we're going to, transition to this idea that in order to get closer to God, to understand God better, we really need to understand what we mean by God. So like starting next episode, we're going to like take off where Josh introduced us today with this idea, well, God is the creator, God is everything. And then we're going to see how, like, if we define God as the creator and everything, we can, from that, understand, God more comprehensively, not just what God is, but how we relate to God. So, again, this has been an excellent first episode. I hope you will tune in. We're going to explore this is just the beginning. We're going to explore all the different kinds of manifestations of God in our life. And thanks for watching, and we will see you again tomorrow night. Thanks for watching.